is the future of Africa. In this program, we focus on Horn of Africa's economic and socio-cultural aspects. Let's share our vision, hopes, and professional critics. All views are esteemed. Stay with us. Dr. Gutu, welcome to this program.
Thank you, Dr. Hussein. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Dr. Gutu is a researcher and human rights advocate. Today we'll have a number of discussions and go deep into our discussion, Dr. Gutu. It's important to talk about the youth movement from 2014 to 2018. And from your viewpoint, what were the fundamental questions of the Oromo youth movement during that time?
Thank you, Dr. Hussein. I think we need to go back a little bit to 2014, when the plan for the expansion of the Addis Ababa city in the name of Addis Ababa Master Plan was planned and announced by the government, by the then TPLF, EPRDF-led government. The youth in Ambo protested first. Then next year in 2015, November, the plan was again rejected or invoked when a land was leased out in Ginchi town. By the protest that was sparked in Ginchi town, the plan, the protest quickly galvanized against Addis Ababa Master Plan. Now, talking about the demands of the youth at that time, we cannot really talk about that demand or the movement in isolation from the historical grievances of the Oromo people. But also we cannot talk in isolation with the question of land as immediate cause for the protest, both for the protest that erupted in Ambo in April 2014, and also later it started in Ginchi in 2015. So it was about governing oneself. That translates also in terms of self-determined development, because this plan was framed as a development plan by the regime, by the government in power, but the protesters framed it as a master killer because they considered it as a threat for their lives and livelihoods and the implications of displacement it would embody. So it was the right not to be displaced from own land, but also that also is within the context of the bigger demands of the Oromo people that has been carried on from historical times, and that has to do with self-governance in terms of governing oneself beyond one's land, but also in terms of developing one's language, and actually in terms of having a dignified, valued place in socio-economic and political setting of the Ethiopian state, which has always opposed, actually, or at least tried to marginalize the political and economic interests of the Oromo people for over a century.
Thank you so much. As you said, the master plan issue was at the heart of the question, and you are correct in saying that the 2014-2018 youth movement is a reflection of the entire people, the Oromo people, and perhaps other nations and nationalities. And basically the questions were about true democracy, good governance, autonomy, accountability, transparency, the rule of law, and the right to exercise your human rights things. And but now the next question might be in relation to this: how much those questions were addressed in your view? I think you have conducted research on that. Which of the questions were addressed? In my view, none of these questions were addressed.
I agree. Basically because of the fact that we read from the ground, things, a lot of promises have been made when the restructuring of the administration of the APRDF was started in 2018. A lot of promises of democracy and rule of law and human rights, and even beyond, have been made. And in fact, talking, or at least reflecting on how much of those demands were addressed, we also need to, let me add on the demand in a sense, because when the master plan was announced, it was an imposition, top-down imposition from the government, with a displacement implication for the people facing the threat historically, but also contemporary. Now, in that plan, the people had no say. It actually came to them, to the people, as a surprise, as something that is benign, that is meant for the development of the people. The expansion of the city, as if it is natural, as if it has no negative implication. That was a plan that is imposed on the people. At the heart of that demand, of course, is also not just not a rejection of a development model of top-down nature, but also a proposal of an alternative model in which people are included. Now, it means, of course, people should have been part of the process in planning such a grand project. Now, let me ask only this question and leave it to the audience whether this has been addressed. Today, people are not consulted about any development plans of the government. Prosperity tries to impose everything. Tries to impose everything on the people, and we don't see now some of the projects that come as a news is also the news for the people living in those areas where those development or those plans are meant to be implemented. So the demand to be part of the development process, to be part of the decision-making process in what affects their own life, has not been addressed. Now, beyond that, of course, today the people are also facing even graver concerns of existing in life. Physical security of the people is greatly threatened. People have been, they had been arrested arbitrarily previously, and this is happening at the same time nowadays as well. So the security of the people, the political rights, human rights, those questions, in fact, have been elevated to an extent that now existing as a people, claiming one's own identity, it has become a security threat that has been framed as a security threat for the existence of the Ethiopian state. So the conditions have even have gone from bad to worse, in a sense that the semblance of peace that was prevailing in those times before the protest, even during the protest, has actually grown enormously, and displacement is rampant. In fact, the protest was against displacement, and today displacement is caused by multiple factors, and people are facing starvation, of course, in part also because there is no government that fairly represents the people. So these questions are not only, they are not addressed, but that is not the only case. In fact, the questions of existential threats has now taken even bigger space in today's political setting in Ethiopia.
Great, Dr. Gutu. I recognize that recently you have conducted research and the article is already published, and the title of the article is "The Master Plan is a Master Killer. Land Disposition and Powerful Resistance in Oromia, Ethiopia." What does this article inform us? I mean, what were your key findings, if you like?
Let me say this in giving a context for this article. This article was developed during the protest itself. While I followed the development of the protest from, I have been gathering evidence as to its trajectory, its motives, its demands, and government's response as well. That protest movement, when it culminated in change of leadership, by that I mean the TPLF's relinquishing power and the new leadership coming to office with a lot of promise. In that context, it was in fact written and published in 2019 in a context of what you can call a lot of promises in those times. What I addressed the manifestations of the protest, the demands, and in fact its successes and the way the government confronted it within using a political ecology framework, but again centering on the question of land, which has always been an epicenter of the struggle, at least for the last 50 or 50 or more years, as the question of land, besides actually the question of nationality. So this describes the protest and the outcomes and its successes in terms of shelving the plan by the government at that time, although that is actually coming up again in different forms, as we could suspect in relation to the newly announced Sugar City plan, for example.
Thanks so much. And this master plan has strong relation directly or indirectly with Finfinnee, and the question of Finfinnee is still mounting from time to time. Why do you think that Finfinnee is kind of vital to the Oromo people, and what is the claim of Oromos over the Finfinnee city?
To me, Finfinnee, which others call Addis Ababa, for others who may not know the name Finfinnee, because that has not been propagated very well, actually. Many people, international scholars, are not very well aware of this name itself. So I really wonder why this is the case. And if you look at this article, I name Finfinnee as such, but also give Addis Ababa in bracket. Addressing or talking about the question of Finfinnee should be within the context of the bigger quest of self-determination of the Oromo people. For me to understand environment-society relations, now environment being actually land-related questions of a society, current disputes and distribution of resources, which has to do with the land, which is not isolated from the question of the expansion of the city itself, because the surrounding farmers have always been displaced. And in fact, again, the foundation of the city itself was based on eradicating, displacing Oromos from their land and actually subjugating their cultures, so much so that they have become, actually the people have become minority in their own native place. So to understand this relationship, in fact, we need to look back into historical events and try to see how they are interpreted at the moment. Now, many things have changed. Whether restoration is possible is another question, but at least recognizing the problems, the historical facts that the people endured is a starting place if we are to resolve current disputes over Finfinnee. So for the Oromo, Finfinnee is a symbol of subjugation, actually, because that is also connected to the expansion of the Abyssinians from the north, and that is one of the garrison towns where settler soldiers settled in expanding to the southwards, not only to conquer the Oromo land, but also other nations and nationalities in the greater south. So for the Oromo, Finfinnee is the belly button of Oromia. They call it actually Finfinnee And Oromia, which means Finfinnee is the center of Oromia, and it is part and parcel of it. As a matter of current administration, it has been actually administered separately of Oromia regional state, but also at the same time, Finfinnee is, at least even by the current constitution, is the capital city of Oromia. So Finfinnee has a lot to symbolize, but also has a lot of implication also in terms of material sense. And I think, but again, the question of Oromo is bigger than Finfinnee. But again, Finfinnee being part of that question, it needs to be recognized as such. So that this article also, because it's related to the master plan, which was intended to expand the city at the expense of the surrounding farmers, which are native Oromo, which has the Oromo people, then the paradox is Finfinnee, which is part of Oromia, which should have been governed by the Oromo themselves, if self-governance has been implemented fairly, is expanding and displacing the Oromo people. So Finfinnee is, in a way, the capital, the socio-economic, political capital of the country, and in a sense, also a lot of interest, where a lot of interest actually come together. And in those interests, you see people trying to minimize the role of the Oromo in Finfinnee, again, trying to marginalize current claims of Oromo by different mechanisms. So Finfinnee has a bigger place, both symbolic, historical, and contemporary material implication for the Oromo struggle.
Thank you for that
but again,
critical reflection. Okay,
yes,
continue, please.
But again, when we talk about Finfinnee, it is not about the people living in that area as well. And if you look at the article that you just referred to, people as far as Begi to the west of Oromia, and Chinakson to the east of Oromia, in the eastern part of Oromia, they actually raised their voices in unison, not because they live in that on that piece of land where the capital city was about to expand to at that time, but because there is a shared identity that goes back to history, but also a shared aspiration of Oromo people's bigger demand of self-determination. So Finfinnee is bigger than itself in that sense as well.
Thanks so much. As you said, the question of Oromo is bigger than Finfinnee, and at the same time, Finfinnee is one of the fundamental questions, and it was at the hub of the youth movement and the question of the Oromo people, because Finfinnee is epicenter of Oromo and Oromia region. With this, I would like to relate or connect this topic with your recent publication entitled State Building and Development in Ethiopia, From Developmental State to Prosperity Model. What is the essence of it, and can you relate this with issues that are related to Finfinnee and Oromia.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, I say that the previous article that you referred to was published in 2019, and this article was published actually this last year, the State Building and Development, the article entitled State Building and Development in Ethiopia, from Developmental State to Prosperity Model. As I said, the previous one was written in a context of hope. This one is written and published after things have been actually pretty much turned to be really against the original demands of the youth movement and broader question of the Oromo people and other peoples of Ethiopia. So this is about state building, but also trying to see how state building is related to development and the trajectories of the current ruling party or its ambitions as reflected in discourses and various evidences. It is ambitions of the kind of state they would like to impose on people. That is the language I intently use because that is an imposition. So that has an implication for possibilities and impossibilities of development to me. So prosperities is not something that can happen in vacuum, but something that actually requires a stable state political structure that really promises peace. And the current trend and the lack of peace and the violence that is erupting in every part of the country is actually a reflection of the intent of the ruling party in imposing its will, which could be considered a unitary state. By and large, okay, they may not spell it that way, but all indications are that they are aspiring to restructure, reinvent Ethiopia in its old image, even if the current conditions may not actually allow a replication of the past in its entirety. Now, this article actually also evaluates the developmental state of the EPRDF and actually critically analyzes the possibilities or the critiques the prosperities. To me, in this article, it's also indicated that elusive neoliberal capitalism, elusive because it has not been tested. It has not been tested, and elusive because it has not been well articulated. It is elusive because it is not grounded on pragmatic possibilities, political, economic realities, and it is also elusive because it does not recognize the political history of the country duly. So I critique that model. And ultimately, the essence of this article is that as long as peace that is founded on an inclusive political structural foundation comes to being, this positive talk of prosperity will only remain a promise, and the conditions do not promise as such. So it is a kind of a warning or a kind of disappointment that comes because after the what has failed in terms of the reform that was promised in 2018.
Thanks so much. Did you see some kind of transformation yes, it's from developmental state to prosperity. Did you see some fundamental change or transformation in terms of the economy of the nation? As you said, this is perhaps against the fundamental questions of the Oromo people. It was a move from federal system to unitary system. That was a kind of attempt, and let's say it in terms of economy. Is there any fundamental shift from developmental state to prosperity?
Now, there is something like the developmental state model of the APRDF, though that it has got many shortcomings. It needs to be recognized because at least there was some recognizable growth in terms of GDP, although it has dramatically failed in terms of making that growth equitable. So it was successful. The APRDF's developmental state was successful in many ways in that sense. But also, as I said, it has failed on accounts of equitable distribution. The Prosperity Party actually, in many ways, negates this, I think, as I said, because it is not well articulated, it does not really identify the challenge of development. It even tries to refashion the state structure, which is problematic, as if it would be a ground for prosperity for the country. So I don't think the prosperity model has taken enough stock of knowledge from that experience of the developmental state. Fundamental shift, because, as I said, state building and development are actually interrelated in many ways. Actually, state building, to me, is also an act of development in its own ways. But also because of its take on, or at least its negation of the promises of multinational federation that was recognized, at least structurally, by the 1995 Constitution. The EPRDF, the Prosperity Party, actually, I think I would say it shatters the prospect of development in many ways. What would have been a better way, actually, is to democratize, possibly, to democratize the developmental state model itself. Now, whether a state should lead an economic development of a country or not is debatable. But the question is not only about that, it is about the nature of the state itself. A democratic state, a state that actually decides for the people against all odds, as if the state knows everything for the people and controls everything. And in fact, EPRDF's developmental state is not necessarily about development. It is about, I call it even, startle development, because it has actually focused on empowering the state structure against the interests of the people. So by shifting from the radical shift from multinational federation to what could be described as a unitary state, and so doing, negating the historical demands of the people, actually, the Prosperity Party, to me, has shattered even the prospect of development in many ways. And the signs of conflict that we see here and there are not totally unrelated to the choices that were politically made by the ruling elites.
Thanks so much, Dr. Guto. I think this is a topic that we need to discuss more, and we'll do that in the future because it requires deep analysis and critical reflections, if you like. And let's move to the other angle of our discussion about peace. As you can observe, the government of Ethiopia is in a position to solve the northern part problems or the war in Tigray through peaceful means. And progress have been made so far. And if you look at the Oromia situation, they tend to solve the existing problem through war. And it's not about peace. So what do you think on that? Why the government intends to push that kind of thing?
Thank you again. This is pretty much something that concerns our people, that pretty much concerns actually all peace-loving people in the country and beyond. There are many questions that could be actually raised even in relation to the peace deal that was signed in Pretoria and later in Nairobi. But that could, at least to begin with, could be received, in fact, should be received in positive terms. And to some, this was also a sign for preparation for peace in other parts of the country. And it's only natural to expect a government that has tried to resolve a conflict in the northern part of the country to do similar, to take similar approach in resolving the conflict in Oromia and other regions as well. Now talking about Oromia, Oromia is at the center, not just the political center in terms of geography, not the geographic center, but also the economic and political center of the state. So it is only self-deception if you think of possibilities of achieving peace in Ethiopia by signing a peace agreement with the TPLF or Tigrayan forces, but come up with all kinds of excuses not to sign or not to engage with legitimate political forces, having articulated their demands, A, B, C, who could come to the table and who have expressed their willingness to come to the table for discussion, for negotiation, then it is only self-deception if you can achieve through war. And again, war, when it comes from beyond your border, probably when there is no other alternative, you may mobilize the people in defense of a country, for example. But when it is actually internal and when it is supported by a lot of people from within, when other alternatives are closed down by the government's own acts, and still you try to squash it by force, then that is not workable. That is not a way to go. So if peace is to be achieved in the country, a peace deal, a different approach from what has been self-evidently propagated by the government should come to the fore, I think.
Great. I think we need to promote that peace, and that peace agreement should be again extended to Oromia. We hope that. With that, let me move to the other angle of today's discussion. Corruption in Ethiopia and Oromia. As you know, corruption has become rampant in Ethiopia and in Oromia. It's getting all a trend or a system, and that will definitely affect the economic and political situation of the country, perhaps aggravate the existing situation. And how do you see this element? I have to raise all the time about corruption. Recently, the Prime Minister talked about it, and he promised to fight. And after a while, there was a kind of being stuck and challenged by those surrounding the system itself, because all through they are corrupted. How do you say this?
Interesting question. Corruption is one of the grand challenges probably for the current regime. And people would say corruption has become rampant to their own acknowledgement of it as such. They acknowledged it as such, and they started to declare that it has taken an institutional form that is a threat for the continuation of the state. Now, there are many problems. There are many internal problems, political problems that needs resolution if the state is to continue as a healthy state at all. But corruption is one of them. They acknowledged it and, in fact, started to take some steps. But if you, I don't know if you have seen it, but recently the Prime Minister said there is no institutional corruption in Prosperity Party. The ruling party is Prosperity Party, and in fact, what he said is it's only petty corruption, small corruption that is probably controllable, and so on. But what was said before that was grand opposite. It is absolutely a sharp opposite to this recent claim. And you can see that probably it has started to backfire. The system that is built on corruption, if it tries to actually get rid of these corrupt elements, and if the whole system is so much affected by it, by the networks of corruption that is inbuilt into the system, then fighting the corruption would not really help. It may help healing the political problem, but the ruling party cannot survive if it duly takes this responsibility to a greater extent. So that they are now refraining from that pursuit, and that tells you also the systemic nature of the corruption. And probably they will probably charge few people or so, and we don't see an aggressive approach coming up, at least in the short run. Corruption then, in addition to other problems of security crisis, political economic crisis, the inflation that we are witnessing day in and day out, all these economic as well as political problems the country is facing, the civil war which is still going on, all these are really grand concerns for the Oromo and for the other peoples of the country as well.
Thanks so much. I was very happy and moved when the Prime Minister promised to fight corruption, particularly in the coming year, because he claimed that corruption is a grand problem, but all of a sudden now it's not a grand problem, it's a petty problem kind of move. Was it a shift of mind, or, as you said, is that because of its power to fight back? If so, how can the country really exist whereby deep crisis is aggravated by corruption, systemic corruption, if you like?
Yes, if we believe now the latest version of the claim that corruption is not really a grand problem, not institutionalized problem of great concern, if we believe in that, we are actually we don't remember what has happened over the last couple of years then, because the Prime Minister said something and it has been proved again and again that he has negated what he has said over the last years, as we know. Then it is fair to believe that corruption is a grand problem, but then when you start to fight it, if it fires back to the extent that it threatens your power. And if you are really adamant in keeping your power, if you are really adamant in keeping the ruling party in power, then you cannot really invite other, you cannot really mobilize other capacity to fight corruption. It could be possible. You can mobilize if you are if you can gain, if you have people's representation, for example. That is not the case. Looking back at the election, there is no popular representation that really the Prosperity Party can claim. So in that sense, you fight corruption, and above all, it affects the people. It affects the country's development and the country's prospect. And if your primary concern is not about the country's prospect or the livelihoods of the people, day in and day out affected by the corrupted behavior of officials at all levels, then if that is not your primary concern, if your power is your primary concern, then you try to speculate or contemplate as to how you can maintain your power, even if you have to avoid dealing with this problem. Now, so I think corruption is a big problem. I don't consider it a shift of power. As I would take it as a shift of mind, only motivated by the intent to maintain power, at least not to really engage in fighting within the party. And this is also informed by probably later information that he may have come across as to how rampant, or after dealing with some elements of the networks of corruption, after probably feeling the heat, he may have come to this decision, and this should be propagated in different language to the people, and that is why he reframed it as a petty corruption, rather than an institutionalized one.
Thanks so much. Well, that was a kind of pretext by the government, because if they keep on the rampant corruption to exist all through, definitely in itself it will fire back the government, and the question of power is again a problem, because corruption and inflation, they do have a great power to challenge any government. Let's move to the other aspect of our discussion. We have been discussing the challenges that encountered in that country: war, corruption, perhaps an absence of peace, and so on. And if you look at Oromia specifically, the challenge, the problem, and every aspect of war is being exercised in that region. And what do you advise the government and Oromo people to get out of this kind of deep crisis?
Now, as I often hesitate to advise the government, but again, as a person, as a concerned citizen, a person actually daily feeling the experience of displacement, all kinds of violations of human rights, untold atrocities that is being perpetrated on the people. I would say this: self-deception will not help anybody, nor the government, nor any other force that has political demand. So that, by that I mean, now claims of, for example, claims of Oromo Liberation Army, if talking about the war that is going on in Oromia, claims of the claims that the government propagates, that the OLA has no unified leadership to talk to, those kinds of claims are so trivial and cannot really be convincing in any sense. The only way for this country, again, the claims of eradicating all opposition within Oromia by brutal force, okay? Brutal force has been actually showcased in Oromia over the last 4 years, but it will not really bring peace. It will not even be concluded by what could be claimed as victory by the government. Now, the question is, are there legitimate political demands? Are they legitimate demands of all kinds? Do we have those legitimate demands? And we need to map the conflict itself. What are which parties or which groups are involved in this conflict? A complete mapping of the conflict and the legitimacy of the demand that is being advanced by all involved should be studied, and that comprehensive study should also be supplemented by an attempt to bridge those demands. This has not been tried. And okay, violence have been tried, not just for 4 years, but for over a century, violence have been tried. And the constitution of the country itself is based on violence. The cities, the country is actually the capital city itself, as we talked about, and the current borders, or what we call modern Ethiopia itself, is based on violence. That history needs to be recognized, and if anything, what the Ethiopian government should learn is, even after fighting for 2 years with the Tigrayan forces, even without so much, is that if there are people fighting or advancing certain causes and forced to raise arms, it is impossible to win people with a cause only by the power of arms, and probably it may grow weaker or so at some stage, but that doesn't mean it would be resolved sustainably. So sustainable solution to this conflict that is in Oromia as well, in other regions to a lesser extent, can only be solved through peaceful negotiation. And again, let me add this: it cannot happen at local level now. It should happen through internationally recognized mechanisms, whereby all serious steps are taken and involving impartial mediators that would give recognition for the process itself at international level. So that also speaks to the way the international community probably could help in resolving the Ethiopian conflict, broadly speaking, going beyond the conflict in the northern part of the country.
Thanks so much. I will have some challenging question for you. What do you understand by prosperity? Not in terms of religion, in terms of economic development. Is there something what you call prosperity? Is it something to be achieved? Because sometimes, for me, even it's not a vision or dream or something, because claiming prosperity without even having the basics like economic growth, economic development, human capital, human development, is a very funny one. And so, just two words, what is it for you?
Prosperity, in the context of Ethiopia, prosperity is a bubble for me. A bubble that flies in the face of reality, contradicting reality. And prosperity as a long-term, very long-term ambition is okay. But again, given Ethiopia's condition, it is another term for development. Okay, let me understand it that way. It is another term, fantasy or romantic framing of development. But again, there should be some conditions. To me, there are minimum conditions that would help address or at least achieve prosperity, and certainly not prosperity party's way. Because prosperity is even beyond prosperity in their mind, as I think, because you say it not in terms of religion, but there are also religious connotations that filters into that concept of prosperity that many of us could guess about.
Yes.
So prosperity, a benign term, something that is flying or at least not connected to the realities that the people are facing. Actually, looking at the daily lives and the daily hardships that the people of Ethiopia entirely are facing, the talk of prosperity is sometimes, it actually inflicts pain in its own sense, not because prosperity it's a bad word as such, but it is it defies logic. It is in fact actually a way of taking debates out of context and
taking. Dr. Guto will be back to it, and we'll further discuss this kind of issues, very critical issues. Now, in the interest of time, I would like to give you a final opportunity for your final remark or remarks, if you like, within a split of second, including your advice to the international community, perhaps.
Yes, the international community has exclusively focused now, it seems at least, what we see from the news, from the international media, exclusively focused on the conflict in the northern part of the country and in resolving that conflict. That is okay, but that exclusive focus would not help the conflicts in other parts of the country. And I think it is time to start to take parallel steps also to put pressure on the government in pushing the government to negotiation table with armed groups in other parts of the country, most notably with Oromo Liberation Army as well. And again, this should be, let me repeat that, this should be taking place in the presence of a third party, internationally recognized. Support is needed. And for Ethiopia to be peaceful in that sense, at least to lay minimum ground that would help come up with possibilities of people achieving self-determination, whether that means coexistence or living together or deciding their fate in other ways based on the constitution, is something that should be supported internationally. For the government, I think it is time to reconsider the positions they have been advancing in relation to Oromo Liberation Army's talk with Oromo Liberation Army. And I think this also goes to the all armed groups. I think that negotiation peaceful resolution is the best option, and it has to be tried. It has to be given a chance.
Thank you, Dr. Gutu. With this, we conclude our today's discussion with Dr. Gutu Olana. For those of you who have professional reflections, visions, critics, or hopes, the door is open. And thanks so much. See you next time. Dr. Gutu, profoundly thank you so much as usual.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
This is the future of Africa. In this program, we focus on Horn of Africa's political, economic, and socio-cultural aspects. Let's share our vision, hopes, and professional critics. All views are stemmed. Stay with us.